Hey there, welcome back. It is the fourth and final week of the Tailored Tulips Quilt Along. I know I had mentioned that this video would go up on Friday, but I had mentioned in my blog earlier that they would post on Tuesday. And I figured I'd send out a couple, I got my calendar mixed up, so I figured better err on the side of the earlier date and post the video early. So if you are, I'm not done sewing, if you're like, I'm not done sewing all my stem blocks, don't worry. You can pretend this video doesn't exist until Friday. I'm Melissa Mortensen of polkadotchair.com, and I am helping you guys sew my Tailored Tulips quilt. It is a spring quilt pattern that is pre-cut friendly. Previously, we talked about how to cut your fabric from your pre-cut pack so that you get the most out of the pre-cut pack. Walked you through piecing the tops of the tulips and the bottom stem portions of the tulips. And then today I'm just going to talk very briefly about finishing the quilt. There is a lot that can be said about finishing a quilt. You could write an entire book just on all the different ways and options and steps to finish a quilt. I thought I would just today kind of walk you through some of common pitfalls that you may run into during this process, things to kind of watch out for and to double check. So the first thing I want to mention is you should have a big stack of tulip blocks. What I like to do, and I will drop a very bad photo of my actual design wall in my studio. I don't have the best lighting on that wall, so it's not the best picture, but you are going to have a bunch of tulip blocks. If you don't have a design wall, you can lay this out on the floor or on the bed. But what you want to do is you want to take a moment and take all of those blocks and lay them out as shown in the diagram. You'll have, so many blocks down by so many blocks across. And check for color balance. Because what you don't want is you don't want to cluster all of the pink pink fabrics in one corner and all the blue fabrics in another corner, unless you want to do that deliberately, but then make sure you're very deliberate with your placement for that. What you want to do is just kind of have a nice even balance of darks and lights and colors throughout the quilt. And you may think that you have it the way you like it, and then you go and sew your quilt together and there's something that pops out to you that's out of place. That is something that I have done many times in quilting before I started using a design wall, which is why I started using a design wall. And like I mentioned, if you don't have a design wall, the one I use actually hooks on grommets. So I just have a couple of command strips up on a flat wall and I hook it up with the grommets, and then I lay the quilt out, and then I snap a picture with my phone so I remember the placement. And then I can just take the quilt wall off of the wall. It has like a fuzzy surface that the quilt blocks will just stick to, so you don't need pins. If you quilt a lot, it's definitely really nice to have a dedicated space for a quilt wall though. I will link up the one that I have in the comments. I'm not 100% sure they sell it anymore, but I will try and find some good options for you if it's not available. So after you have double checked your placement, and like I said, I always like to snap a picture with my phone so I remember where I want to put each of the blocks. There's a couple of things that I recommend you do. The first thing is count and make sure you have the right number of blocks. So for the lap size quilt you should have 28 completed blocks, and for the baby quilt you'd have 13. And double check that your block is 6.5 by 14.5 inches at this point. That might not seem super important, but sometimes during the construction process, if your seam allowances are off a little bit, you'll end up with a block that is 6.5 by 14.75, which might not seem like a big deal, but you've got, if you've got 8 tulip blocks, on top of each other, 8 times 1/4 inch, that's going to give you an extra almost 2 inches, I think. Don't test my quick math. On your length. So when you go and put your borders and your sashing pieces in, they're not going to be long enough. It's not going to fit. So double check that this is the correct size. If it is too large, trim it from the bottom. Don't trim it from the top. You've got a little bit of leeway there to kind of make sure that those are all the correct size. If it is too small, you can kind of fudge a little bit the sashing. So if you're, if you're short by 1/8 of an inch, you can kind of, with your little sashing border pieces, you can kind of make like a slightly smaller seam allowance, but be careful with doing that. The other option is if every single one of your blocks are 6.5 by 14 1/4, then just go with it. If there's one that's a little bigger, just cut them all to 6.5 by 14 1/4, because you can make it, it's fine if they're smaller, you'll just have a little bit of extra sashing that you cut off at the bottom, so that's not a big deal. The bigger problem is if they're too large. So the assembly instructions are on the pattern. They start on page 10. I've provided a diagram for you guys. It is really simple. You're just going to sew tulip block to sashing piece, tulip block to sashing piece, tulip block to sashing piece, over and over, and then you've got a couple of extra stem pieces that you're going to sew that are noted in the pattern, so that you've got those tulips at the bottom with the really long stems. And then on the top, to get these to be staggered, you have a few pieces of fabric, background fabric here at the top, that kind of gives it that staggered effect, so that they kind of start at different levels. So this quilt is assembled by columns. Most quilts, at least when I sew, I'll assemble a quilt by rows. Like I'll sew row 1 together and row 3, and row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4, and then sew all the rows to each other. But this one's a little bit different in the fact that you sew all of your columns to each other first. Also with this, again, double check that you're using an exact 1/4 inch seam allowance, so that you don't end up with too long or too short of columns. And then if you want to be super precise, you can, after you sew them together, use a measuring tape and measure how long that piece is, and make sure that they're all the same length, and adjust as necessary, because the next thing you're going to do is start sewing. I'll show you on the baby one, it's easier. And like I said, this is in the pattern. You're going to start sewing, sashing in between those column rows. So if some of these are longer and shorter, then you can kind of run into some trouble with this tulip not being the same height as this tulip, being the same height as this tulip. So take a minute and kind of check that. I also recommend, when you're sewing, either always start from the top and work down, or always start from the bottom and work to the top. I don't like to alternate directions, because I think you end up with pieces that aren't straight. So I prefer to know that, like, across the top, all of these pieces are flush. So I'll start sewing all of them across the top. And then that way, if you have some stretching or something's not lining up across the bottom, it's a lot easier to square off the bottom of these tulip blocks than it is to try and like even up the tops of those tulips, because you've got a little bit of extra stem piece on the bottom there. So that is it. You're going to sew tulip blocks to each other, adding sashing, so sashing between the columns, and then I've got a piece at the top and the bottom to finish that off. And then as far as finishing the quilt, sorry about that, I had a frog in my throat, I had to go get a drink. But as far as finishing the quilt, the possibilities are endless. I do have a blog post on my blog that I'll link that is all the steps to finishing a quilt. You can finish it by machine, you can send it off to a long arm quilter, you can long arm quilt it yourself. I put minky fabric on the back of one of my quilts. I have cotton fabric on the back of another. I have used cotton sheets. I have used wide back fabrics. Like I said, the possibilities are endless. And that is all. I hope you guys enjoyed this series. Let me know what you might be interested in sewing next, or if you have any questions about anything. And as always, if you have friends that you think would love this quilt along, send them my way. I really appreciate your time and support, and thank you so much for following along with me for this quilt along.